Señores, algo que nos ha quedado muy claro en las últimas semanas es que Donald Trump odia todo lo que no tiene. Una de las cosas que más le hace falta y que más lo enfurece es inteligencia. Y no, amigos, no me refiero solo a su cerebro de gelatina, el cual ya todos conocemos. Me refiero también a que no tiene informes reales de inteligencia, informes que respalden las mentiras que él ha estado diciendo, tanto sobre el ataque a Irán como sobre el desastre que vino después para intentar taparlo. Claro, como todo le está saliendo mal, ahora está desesperado por encontrar a quién echarle la culpa. Amigos y amigas, todo esto apunta a que la próxima cabeza en la lista de sacrificios es alguien que se atrevió a contradecir a Trump con datos reales. Alguien como Tulsi Gabbard, su propia directora de inteligencia nacional. Así, señores, acaba de recibir un golpe político muy fuerte. Y esto, sin duda alguna, la tiene en la cuerda floja. Antes de que pasemos a hablar de Tulsi Gabbard, quiero que veamos el contexto. Un ejemplo perfecto de cómo alguien intenta evitar caer en la misma trampa en la cual ahora está atrapada ella. Y me refiero a Pete Hegseth. Y esto lo ha explicado a la perfección Tim Miller. Escuchemos.
The lack of seriousness of Secretary Hegseth and just this feeling that you've got to butter up President Trump and you've got to make him feel like he was right and you've got to make him feel strong, like we're living in some country where you have a king or a dictator who needs to be sucked up to it. It feels un-American and unserious rather. And you can see the contrast just this morning in the press briefings between the Secretary of Defense and General Kane, who gave a detailed, thoughtful analysis of what we know and don't know. About the extent of the damage with regards to the nuclear facilities, and so it's possible to do it. We've seen it. You saw it in Trump 1.0, where for all of my criticisms of it, there were some serious people, like General Mattis, that did not play along with this reality show. And unfortunately, in this term, like you have this very serious issue. We're dealing with life or death. We're dealing with nuclear weapons, with war, with geopolitics, and the fact that you have to have a Secretary of Defense go out on TV and berate the media like they're children and do all this puffery about the president. To me, it shows a lot of insecurity and just a lack of seriousness in the Pentagon.
Yo sé que Pete Hegseth podrá ser un incompetente, pero bueno, le sobra lealtad a Trump. Y para el presidente eso vale más que 1000 neuronas. Lo hemos visto cómo se humilla en sí mismo en una conferencia de prensa solo para atacar a los medios, especialmente a los que Donald Trump odia. Todo para quedar bien con el jefe. Pero lo que no pudo hacer Pete Hegseth, y aquí es donde entra Tulsi Gabbard, fue decir algo que tuviera sentido o estuviera basado en hechos. El resultado, una sesión informativa de inteligencia para el Congreso que fue cancelada. Y eso, tal y como lo explicaron en este segmento, es clave para entender lo que está ocurriendo. Escuchen.
There are so many questions I have been looking forward to asking this administration, including, first and foremost, what was the intelligence that showed us the urgency of actually taking military action against Iran? I'm also extremely concerned that the president decided to unilaterally and illegally make this decision without not only getting authorization from Congress, but not briefing Congress. And I think the fact that they canceled this briefing today just goes to show how chaotic this administration really is.
Reitero mis palabras, Donald Trump no tiene inteligencia, ni literal ni figuradamente. No tiene información verificada que pueda respaldar este ataque a Irán. Mucho menos tiene pruebas para decir que fue un gran éxito militar. De hecho, lo contrario es cierto. Lo que se filtró en CNN nos demostró que fue un fracaso rotundo. Y esto en gran parte por culpa del propio Trump, por sus tweets impulsivos, por su torpeza total. Y bueno, ¿qué tiene que ver Tulsi Gabbard en todo esto? Pues resulta que ella ha venido contradiciendo a Trump en más de una ocasión sobre Irán. Y ahora que se siguen filtrando documentos que ella misma supervisa, pues bueno, el presidente no está para nada contento, porque cada nuevo detalle que sale a la luz lo deja en evidencia. Y es por eso, amigos, que no quiere que algo como esto vuelva a ocurrir.
The IC continues to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and Supreme Leader Khamenei has not authorized the nuclear weapons program that he suspended in 2003.
How close do you personally think that they were to getting one? Because Tulsi Gabbard testified in March that the intelligence community said Iran wasn't building a nuclear weapon.
I don't care what she said. I think they were very close to having one.
Tulsi Gabbard fue excluida de un importante informe de inteligencia con el Senado. Y ojo, esto no es normal. Es muy raro que una funcionaria de ese nivel sea apartada de una sesión informativa sobre seguridad nacional en Medio Oriente. La Casa Blanca lo confirmó y bueno, como siempre, intentaron minimizar la situación, diciendo que está trabajando en otras tareas importantes. Pero bueno, yo creo que todos sabemos leer entre líneas. La están castigando. En colmo, ¿no? Un biógrafo de Trump dijo en un podcast que Tulsi Gabbard está caminando sobre hielo muy, pero muy delgado tras las filtraciones que expusieron que el ataque no logró nada en las instalaciones nucleares iraníes. Entonces, todo esto en conjunto ha dejado a la administración completamente avergonzada. Entonces, ¿cómo es posible que la directora de Inteligencia Nacional no esté participando en informes de inteligencia? O sea, ¿qué nos dice todo esto? 1. Que tal vez la ven como un riesgo dentro del equipo. 2. Que probablemente esté dispuesta a decir verdades que Trump no quiere escuchar. Tal vez, y al parecer, Tulsi Gabbard no es tan leal como creían. A diferencia de Pete Hegseth, que se arrastra felizmente por quedar bien, Tulsi Gabbard podría estar empezando a avergonzar a Trump. ¿Está en la cuerda floja? Puede ser. Y si algún dominó va a caer, probablemente no será Pete Hegseth, y será Tulsi Gabbard. Donald Trump ya ha dejado claro que sacarla no le costaría nada, que reemplazarla por otro títere tampoco. Pero el problema es este: los que están entrando en cargos de seguridad nacional, amigos, parecen sacados de un episodio de comedia. Algunos de los personajes más ignorantes del país están siendo nombrados para cargos claves, tal y cual lo explicó Rachel Maddow, como solo ella sabe hacerlo. Escuchemos.
But here in the United States, this follows a new National Terrorism Advisory Alert from our government's Department of Homeland Security, which advises that Trump's decision to bomb Iran, quote, could contribute to U.S.-based individuals plotting violent attacks here in the United States. So again, if you're the U.S. government, think about what you're going to do to respond to circumstances like this, right? How do you prepare us as a country? How might you harden our defenses or try to avert any such attack, which our government, again, is now warning about? Well, again, it depends on who is running the U.S. government. And in the case of President Donald Trump, the way he has been preparing the government for this eventuality is by forcing out the head of the National Security Branch at the FBI. Don't worry, though, there's also a National Security Division at the Department of Justice. Well, Trump demoted the acting head of the National Security Division at the Department of Justice, apparently because that acting chief didn't move quickly enough after the inauguration to take down the picture of President Biden and put up the picture of President Trump. And so he was demoted out of that job. That said, the FBI also has its own specific counterterrorism division. He appears to have been pushed out. He left the FBI last month. But don't worry, there is at least one senior counterterrorism position in the United States government that has been definitively and deliberately filled by this president. It's at the Department of Homeland Security. Department of Homeland Security's domestic counterterrorism hub leads nationwide efforts to prevent targeted acts of violence of all kinds. President Donald Trump, in his infinite wisdom, has put this man in charge of that at Homeland Security. Feast your eyes. He's 22 years old, 1 year out of college, with no evident national security experience whatsoever. Before volunteering for the Trump campaign, his LinkedIn page reportedly explains that his work experience includes, quote, lawn care work around my neighborhood. Also, working part-time as a clerk at an H-E-B supermarket. He also apparently once had an internship at the Heritage Foundation, and according to a recent ProPublica profile of this young man, again, who is Donald Trump's best guess at who would make a good counterterrorism chief for the United States government at this moment in time, according to ProPublica, quote, the bulk of his leadership experience comes from having served as Secretary General of a model United Nations club in school. But now that is who Donald Trump has running domestic counterterrorism efforts for the U.S. government, for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. I feel duty-bound to inform you that the left eyebrow is itself registered as a lethal weapon. So underestimate him at your peril, ladies. In April, there was an arson attack targeting Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro and his family at the governor's mansion in Pennsylvania. 4 days later, a self-proclaimed white supremacist shot up the campus of Florida State University, wounding 6 people and killing 2. ProPublica notes that he used a picture of Hitler as the profile picture for his online accounts. In May, there was a car bombing of a fertility clinic in California for somebody who ascribes to some sort of anti-natalist, bizarre extremist ideology. In late May, 2 employees of the Israeli embassy were murdered in Washington, D.C. In June, an event in support of Israeli hostages in Gaza was the target of a bizarre firebombing attack in Colorado in which 12 people were injured. Last weekend, 1 Minnesota Democratic leader and her husband were assassinated. Another Minnesota Democratic legislator was shot 9 times and has thus far survived. His wife was shot 8 times. She has just miraculously been released from the hospital. So it's not like domestic counterterrorism is a niche concern in America right now. Even before the new and explicit warning about potential revenge inside this country for Trump's decision to bomb Iran. But from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, where the director is off the Quiet Skies Air Marshal list herself now, and Trump has thrown out that whole program for the whole country because who cares about that stuff, where they are now unleashed at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence so the office can be on full alert for the lizard people to move their power centers into the secret underground cities, right? From the DNI to the decimation of the Justice Department, and particularly the FBI, which is now led at the director and deputy director level by 2 right-wing podcasters, to the Department of Homeland Security, where a lawn boy and model UN kid has been appointed to lead counterterrorism in every element of its responsibility to keep the American people safe. The U.S. government under Donald Trump is, I guess, doing the best they're capable of. This is the best they can do. This is your government under Trump Republican leadership. Working to keep...
Y bueno, señores, ahora pasemos a hablar, reiteremos nuevamente lo que es el gran y hermoso proyecto de ley de Trump, un proyecto que va demasiado lejos. Es hora de hablar de este intento de reforma tributaria y de recortes sociales que se ha estado convirtiendo en un verdadero desastre político. El tema central antes de todo este caos con Irán e Israel. Vamos a ver cómo funciona esta iniciativa, quién se ve afectado realmente y por qué incluso dentro del propio Partido Republicano existe una división. Escuchemos este fragmento de lo que está pasando en el Congreso mientras intentan sacar adelante este ambicioso plan.
Let's get the latest from NBC News senior national political reporter Sahil Kapoor, and also with us, senior writer for The Dispatch, David Drucker, and former advisor to Speaker John Boehner, Maura Gillespie. Sahil, break down this news we just learned that could scramble this debate for Republicans.
Yeah, Anna, this is a significant setback for Senate Republicans and President Trump's one big beautiful bill. The parliamentarian, which is the Senate's in-house referee, has disqualified a bunch of provisions from this piece of legislation, provisions that could total as much as several $100 billion in savings. These provisions that have now been ruled ineligible for this process include Medicaid cuts and eligibility restrictions on the basis of immigration status. That includes federal money to states based on how they run their eligibility process. It includes reimbursement rules for PBMs. And this is a big one, changes to Medicaid provider taxes, which is a major source of savings that Republicans have been eyeing in this bill. That is now knocked out. Another provision that has been removed, a funding restriction under the Affordable Care Act. If you add it up, there are a ton of savings here that have now been tossed out of this bill. Senate Republicans are going to try to reword some of these provisions to ensure that they comply with the rules, but it's not really clear how many of them they can cure. The Republican sources I've talked to this morning say this is not fatal to the bill. They remain optimistic they can get it done. They're going to try to adjust the language on some provisions. The one they're most worried about is the Medicaid provider tax because that gave them the biggest source of savings here. Now, Anna, they were hoping to start voting on this bill tomorrow. That has been thrown into further doubt because the bill clearly isn't ready for prime time as is.
And Sahil, just for perspective here, this isn't the first time the parliamentarian has ruled against an administration's wishes. We saw this happen with President Biden and the Democrats, too, correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. We saw several of President Biden and Democratic priorities in 2021 and 2022 get knocked out of their reconciliation bills by the parliamentarian. That includes a minimum wage increase. Remember Senator Kyrsten Sinema's famous thumbs down on the floor? That's what that was about. It also includes Democrats trying at the time to legalize the Dreamer population through the reconciliation process. That was ruled ineligible by the parliamentarian. So she has been fair in terms of saying immigration policy changes that either party is trying to do in reconciliation are not valid.
So, Maura, this whole issue with the parliamentarian aren't the only issues that Republicans have been grappling with. There's still the state and local tax deductions, also known as SALT, the rural hospital funding issues, deficit reduction issues. So if you are the Speaker or Senator Thune right now, how worried are you?
Well, you know, Senator Thune has already said that some Republicans in the Senate are coming around to the fact that the SALT tax needs to be dealt with, and they have to come around to the fact that that's something that is a non-negotiable for House Republicans to get this bill across the finish line. So there is some concessions being made as far as within the fractures that the Republican Party is facing. But you mentioned rural hospitals. I mean, that's a big issue for a lot of members. SNAP cuts is also a big issue for a lot of Republican members, as well as the Medicaid issues. And so John Thune, the Senate Majority Leader, has just said that he is not planning to delay anything yet, but that these cuts, he's not going to push back at the parliamentarian because he knows that it goes both ways, right? You can't just cherry pick when you decide that the parliamentarian serves a purpose. And so I think that the Senate Majority Leader knows that. But it's this self-imposed deadline is really their own making. They don't need to push it this weekend, but we'll see what happens in that regard.
And so thus, as you point out, if they don't do it before this weekend, it's not like there are some kind of major consequence, although they might face the wrath of the president. Right. That would be the consequence for the party. Multiple provisions concerning Medicaid funding, as we mentioned, David, were struck down. The other issue with that is they were key in paying for Trump's tax cuts. So if the GOP can't get funds from there, where do they turn?
Yeah, really good question. I think one thing to understand is, except for a few budget hawks, nobody really cares about whether or not you're able to pay for this. They don't care about the deficit consequences. They're interested in the pro-growth tax cut aspect of this. That's how they look at taxes, as very pro-growth and stimulative to the economy. They also look at this just politically as how they're going to deliver most of their 2024 campaign promises, because there's not much else they're going to do between now and the midterm elections, at least not really of consequence when you look at the border provisions and the tax and spending provisions that are rolled up into this reconciliation package. So I don't think it's the deadline that's that important because they do have plenty of wiggle room here. I'd look at the August recess as more of a deadline. But Sahil, knows this. Moore knows this. If you don't give these guys false deadlines, they don't feel any sense of urgency to get anything done. And I think that's why they've been pushing for this July 4th thing to happen. And look, never underestimate a politician's ability to explain how the policy they opposed is not actually the policy they're opposing, and therefore they found a way to support it.
I get what you're saying there, David. Well done. Sahil, we've heard from Congressman Greg Steube now calling on the vice president to overrule the parliamentarian. That's something Senator Thune has vowed he would not do, but he could fire her, something Alabama Senator Tommy Tuberville is now calling for. Is that something you could see him doing?
There is no indication at this time, Anna, that Senate Republicans are considering either overruling the parliamentarian or firing the parliamentarian. This gets dangerously close to nuking the filibuster, which both parties have been poking holes in for quite a long time. Remember, they're using this process to get around the filibuster, and the more you stretch it, the more you try to disregard or try to get around some of the rules that limit what you can do in the filibuster-proof process, the more you have to answer the question, why do you want the 60-vote threshold to begin with? So Senate Majority Leader John Thune has promised to protect that 60-vote threshold, but it is a tradition among members of the House to start throwing grenades over at the Senate, so to speak, to try to get them to overcome the 60-vote threshold. It's very common, I think, to see these frustrations play out in the reconciliation process.
So maybe common, but more on bottom line, what do Republicans do? What are they going to do?
They need to do a better job of messaging. I'd say that just first and foremost, because if we push this to the August recess, they go home to their constituents and they have to explain why it is that they wanted to get this done right now, why they made the cuts that they made, because regardless, any bill that comes across Congress is not perfect. There's no such thing as perfect legislation, especially when it comes to our finances. So sacrifices have to be made, cuts will be made, but it's a matter of messaging to your constituents directly. And I think that that's going to be the biggest task ahead of them, is to be unified in, okay, we had to make some sacrifices, but we want to get this done. XYZ, here's why. But I do think that some of these things that the parliamentarian has shot down are for the best. You know, Senator Mike Lee had this provision about selling public lands. I think that she shot that down, and I'm glad that she did. You know, I think there are some things that just have gone too far. And so it's important to have this kind of a barometer to say, okay, no, that doesn't really fall into this bill. Just like you mentioned, that some of those provisions under President Biden were also pushed back on. And it's important to have that kind of third-party check there. So for the House to be saying, abolish it, get rid of it, I know Rep. Bandrew from New Jersey also said to get rid of it. That just shows me that they don't understand why we have systems in place that we do.
And David, President Trump is still set to hold a big, beautiful bill event today at the White House. What sort of pressure do you imagine he's putting on Republicans? Reminder, he wants this done next week.
Yeah, look, he's putting the screws to them, but I think that it's working in this regard. You know, this party, unlike the 2017 tax bill, where it helped that he largely stayed out of the negotiations and delegated to Treasury Secretary Mnuchin and others, this time around, he's really essential. And that's why John Thune, the Senate Majority Leader, is working so closely with him. Let Trump be the one to explain to people why this needs to get done one way or the other. Because Republican voters, at the end of the day, they trust Donald Trump a lot more than they trust congressional Republicans. And if he wants this done, and there's going to be political uncertainty regardless, given some of these provisions, are the Medicaid cuts going to hurt people? Are people going to think that the tax cuts were for them versus, you know, other people? If Trump gives this his seal of approval, at least congressional Republicans, from a purely political standpoint, can say, listen, Trump campaigned on this, Trump believed in this, and we are with him, even if we have some doubts. That's a much better place for them to be. Trump won't be on the ballot next year, and you do not want a depressed Republican base who just says...
Ok, amigos, recapitulemos. El proyecto de ley de Trump y de los republicanos quieren aprobar, oficialmente no, se llama el proyecto de ley de reconciliación. Hablamos de una herramienta legislativa muy poderosa, que permite aprobar temas presupuestarios con una mayoría simple. De este modo evitan lo que es el filibuster de 60 votos. Entonces, ojo, esto tiene reglas pero muy estrictas. Aquí es donde entra en juego lo que es el Parlamento del Senado, el parlamentario. Hablamos de una figura neutral, que es la que revisa si cada parte del proyecto cumple con esas reglas. Y bueno, ¿qué hizo? Tiró prácticamente al suelo buena parte de las medidas más polémicas de este proyecto. O hablamos de recortar Medicaid, restricciones migratorias encubiertas, cambios en fondos para estados. Hablamos de puntos muy interesantes que fueron descartados porque se consideraron fuera del alcance del proceso de reconciliación. Ok, hasta aquí ya es un problema muy serio para los republicanos, porque gran parte de esos recortes era prácticamente la base financiera para pagar los famosos impuestos pro crecimiento de Trump, los que tanto ha vendido, ¿no?, como su legado económico. Sin esos recortes, ¿cómo pueden pagar el plan? Bueno, parece que no tienen una respuesta clara. Esto es lo que me lleva a esta primera crítica. Este proyecto, señores, no solo es ideológico, es algo muy, pero muy irresponsable. Se basa en recortar programas sociales que afectan a millones de personas que son vulnerables solo para poder financiar recortes fiscales que beneficien, en principio, a empresas, a corporaciones, gente de altos ingresos. Donald Trump, como siempre, nos vendió esto como algo progresivo, cuando en realidad profundiza la desigualdad. Además, ¿qué es lo peor? Que algunos republicanos, como el representante Greg Steube, están pidiendo directamente que se elimine el parlamentario o que se ignore su dictamen. O sea, cuando algo no les gusta, quieren romper las reglas del sistema. Y aquí vemos el claro ejemplo de cómo priorizan resultados políticos sobre la institucionalidad democrática. Señores, lo que estamos viendo es un proyecto de ley que pretende ser esta gran promesa electoral de Trump, pero que en realidad es prácticamente un revoltijo de recortes injustificados, que tienen un enfoque miope en recortar impuestos y no están pensando en las consecuencias sociales. Pero bueno, ¿qué opinan ustedes, amigos? ¿Creen que los republicanos deberían insistir con este proyecto tal y como está? ¿O que debería haber un enfoque un poco más equilibrado entre el crecimiento económico, la protección social? Los invito a que me dejen sus opiniones en la caja de comentarios. Muchísimas gracias por acompañarme el día de hoy. Recuerda, como siempre, dale like, compártelo con tus amigos y suscríbete a nuestro canal. Políticamente en desacuerdo. Nos vemos en el próximo video. Hasta luego.